What happens when the most powerful woman in American biotechnology has spent 3 years, 4 specialists, 11 clinical trials, and $100 million of her own personal fortune trying to diagnose a condition that has stolen her energy, her clarity, her ability to stay in a room for more than 40 minutes without her hands going numb and her vision blurring at the edges, and every doctor she has seen, from the best neurologists in Boston to a specialist in Zurich who charged $40,000 for a single consultation, has told her some version of the same thing. The tests are inconclusive. The symptoms are unusual. We recommend continued monitoring. And the actual answer, is found not in a clinical trial or a specialist's office or a research paper, but by a man who mops the floors of her company's headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who has a 7-year-old son who earns $19 an hour and who notices something on a Tuesday morning in March that 4 years of the most expensive medicine in America had completely missed. Her name was Caroline Merritt. She was 41 years old, and she had built Meridian Biotech from a hypothesis in a research grant in 2009 into one of the most respected independent biotech companies in the country. Meridian did not make the drugs that generated headlines. It made the platform technologies, the delivery mechanisms, the targeting systems, the infrastructure of modern therapeutics that other companies built upon. It was the kind of work that required you to understand not just what a drug did, but how it moved through a body, how it found what it was looking for, how it was stopped by the things that were supposed to stop it and passed by the things that should have. Caroline understood bodies at a molecular level. She had a PhD in biochemistry from MIT and a medical degree she had never used clinically because the lab had always been more interesting to her than the clinic. She had 17 patents. She had testified before the FDA 3 times. She had been on the cover of a trade publication with a headline that called her the architect of the next generation of targeted therapy, which she had found both flattering and slightly premature. She had also, for the past 4 years, been unable to explain why her own body was doing what it was doing. It had started slowly, the way these things do. A tiredness in the late afternoons that seemed more than the tiredness a person running a company should feel, a coldness in her hands that went beyond office air conditioning, a visual disturbance at the edges of her field of vision, not pain, not darkness, just a slight softening of the periphery that made her feel sometimes like she was watching her own life through frosted glass, headaches that arrived without warning and left without pattern, and the cognitive fog. The one she found hardest to admit to anyone, including herself, the moments where a sentence she had started internally did not complete itself, where she reached for the name of a compound she had been working with for a decade and found the space where it should have been temporarily empty. She had gone to her internist first, then to a neurologist, then to a second neurologist, then to an endocrinologist, a rheumatologist, a hematologist, and a cardiologist. She had had an MRI, 2 CT scans, an echocardiogram, a sleep study, a spinal tap, and approximately 47 vials of blood drawn and analyzed under conditions that her research background told her were thorough and her symptoms told her were insufficient. She had flown to the Cleveland Clinic. She had flown to Mayo. She had flown to Zurich. The $40,000 Zurich consultation produced a recommendation for a further autoimmune panel and the suggestion that she manage her stress levels, which she had received with a composure that required significant effort. She had not told her board, she had not told her executive team beyond her assistant of 6 years, a woman named Patricia who managed Caroline's calendar with the focused protectiveness of someone who understood that the calendar was the most visible symptom of a situation that needed to remain invisible. She had restructured her schedule around the bad days. She had moved her most demanding meetings to the mornings when the fog was lighter. She had installed a couch in her office that Patricia explained to visitors as a wellness initiative. The $100 million had come from her personal estate, accumulated over 12 years of Meridian's growth, and a secondary offering she had timed with the specific financial precision she brought to everything. She had funded 3 separate research initiatives through a private medical trust, one investigating rare autoimmune disorders, one looking at mitochondrial function in high-performing adults with late-onset symptoms, and one that she had simply described to the trust administrator as unexplained neurological presentation, Woman, early 40s, otherwise healthy, because she could not bring herself to write my name on the problem. None of the 3 initiatives had produced an answer. They had produced papers which were valuable to other people and useless to her in the specific way that comprehensive knowledge of a problem without a solution is useless. She read every paper. She understood every paper. She was no closer. On a Tuesday morning in March, 4 years into the process, she arrived at the Meridian building on 1st Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts at 7:20 in the morning, which was her habit because 7:20 gave her 40 minutes before the building filled with people and the day became a performance and the fog had not yet begun its daily negotiation. She took the stairs to the 5th floor because the elevator required a badge hold that sometimes made her hands unreliable, and she did not want to be seen fumbling with the badge reader by anyone's confidence she needed to maintain. She was on the 3rd floor landing when she passed the janitor. He was working the 3rd floor corridor, the one with the long windows overlooking the courtyard, with the specific, unhurried efficiency of someone who has cleaned this corridor enough times to have a system and trusts the system. He had a cart with supplies on it and a mop, and he was moving along the baseboard near the window with the focused attention of someone who was not going through the motions, but was actually looking at what he was doing. His name was Owen Garrett. She knew this because his badge said Owen, and she had a habit, developed in her years of running a company where she believed everyone's name mattered, of reading name badges. She did not know anything else about him. He had been on the facilities team for, she thought, about 6 months. She had passed him perhaps a dozen times in that corridor and had said good morning each time, and he had said good morning, and that was the extent of their relationship. She said good morning. He said good morning. She kept walking. Then she stopped. She stopped because she had caught herself with her right hand against the wall without remembering reaching for it. The edges of her vision had gone soft. The fog was early today, earlier than usual, and the stairwell had been harder than it should have been, and she was standing in the 3rd floor corridor with her hand against the wall at 7:20 in the morning, trying to look like a person who had simply paused to check something on her phone. She was looking at her phone. She was not reading her phone. Owen said from behind her, "Are you all right?" She turned. He was looking at her with the specific, direct attention of someone who has noticed something and is not going to pretend they haven't. He was perhaps 38, 39, with dark eyes and the steady, unhurried quality of a person who was not performing his concern. She said, "I'm fine, thank you." He said, "Okay." He paused. "Do you want me to get someone?" She said, "No, truly, I'm fine." He held her gaze for a moment. She had the sense that he was reading something, not intrusively, but carefully, the way a person reads something they want to understand before they respond. Then he said, "Your left eyelid." She said, "What?" He said, "It's drooping slightly. The left one." He said it simply, factually, without alarm. "It's been like that every time I've seen you in this hallway, more pronounced some mornings than others. Today is more." Caroline was very still. She said, "You've noticed that." He said, "I notice things." He looked back at his cart. "I'm sorry if that's overstepping." She said, "What else have you noticed?" He looked at her. He seemed to be assessing whether she was asking a real question or a polite one. He appeared to conclude it was real. He said, "You favor your left side in the mornings, your right side by afternoon. You hold the wall with your right hand going up the stairs. I've heard the footstep pattern from the landing, and by the return trip in the evening, it's more even." He paused. "The eyelid is the most consistent thing. Left side, partial ptosis, most days, worse today." She stared at him. She said, "How long have you been noticing this?" He said, 3 months roughly, since I moved to this floor." She said, "Why didn't you say anything?" He said, "It wasn't my place." He met her eyes. "You're saying something now. That made it my place." Caroline looked at the man with the mop and the cart in the 3rd floor corridor at 7:20 in the morning and felt something shift in her chest that was not a symptom. It was the specific feeling of a person who has been given a piece of information that has been sitting in plain sight for an unacceptable amount of time and has just now arrived where it needed to go. She said, "What is your background if you don't mind me asking?" He said, "I was a paramedic for 11 years. He said it without elaboration or apology. He picked up the mop. "I had a son 7 years ago. His mother died when he was 2. I needed work that let me be home by 3:30 when he got out of school." He paused. "Facilities pays what it pays. The hours work." She said, "Owen." He looked at her.
She said, partial ptosis, left-sided, asymmetric, worse in the morning, improving through the afternoon. She was already running it through the framework that was always running in the back of her mind, the biochemist's reflex of pattern and pathway. She said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. He said, okay. She said, if you had seen this presentation in the field, paramedic, patient, those symptoms in that progression pattern, what would you be thinking about? Owen looked at her for a long moment. He said, myasthenia gravis. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the building's ventilation system made its steady sound. Caroline stood in the third-floor hallway with her hand no longer on the wall and her vision slightly soft at the edges, and heard a diagnosis she had never once in 4 years and $100 million had anyone suggest to her. She knew myasthenia gravis. Of course she knew it. She knew its mechanism, the
autoimmune attack on the acetylcholine receptors at the neuromuscular junction, the resulting failure of the communication between nerve and muscle, the characteristic fatigue that worsened with use and improved with rest. She knew it presented with ptosis. She knew it presented with bilateral weakness, with the fatigable pattern, with the specific morning versus evening variation that she had been living inside for 4 years and had described to 11 doctors who had run the standard autoimmune panels and received inconclusive results and moved on. She said, the panels were negative. He said, seronegative myasthenia gravis is about 15% of cases. He said it the way a paramedic says a fact, not to be impressive, because it is relevant. He said, AChR antibody negative doesn't rule it out. You need the MuSK antibody and the LRP4 test and a single fiber EMG. She was very still. She said, I've had 4 EMGs. He said, repetitive nerve stimulation or single fiber? She said, repetitive. He said, single fiber is more sensitive for myasthenia by a significant margin. She looked at this man in the Cambridge morning light with his facilities badge and his cart and the mop that he was holding with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she understood, with the specific clarity of someone whose entire professional life had been built on following a pathway of evidence wherever it led, regardless of where she had expected it to go, that she had been looking at the right disease from the wrong diagnostic angle for 4 years. She said, who is your son? He looked at her. She said, you mentioned him. What's his name? He said, Theo. He's 7. He paused. He wants to be an astronaut or a chef. He has not decided which. She said, those are not mutually exclusive. He said, that is what I tell him. She said, Owen, can I ask you to come up to my office when you have a break? He said, I have a break at 9. She said, 9 then. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk and she looked at the wall opposite her, and she ran the mechanism in her head, the acetylcholine receptor, the neuromuscular junction, the fatigable ptosis, the asymmetric presentation, the morning severity, and every piece of what she had been experiencing for 4 years was not only consistent with seronegative myasthenia gravis, it was a textbook case of it, presented in a textbook sequence, and that 11 doctors had missed it because they had run the standard panel, seen the negative result, and moved on to the next hypothesis, rather than pursuing the alternative antibody tests that a paramedic with 11 years of field experience had known to ask about in a hallway conversation at 7:20 in the morning. She called her neurologist. She left a message requesting a specific fiber EMG and a full MuSK and LRP4 antibody panel, with a note that said, please do not route this to standard autoimmune screening. I need these specific tests. She called the clinical lab she had worked with for 12 years. She called Patricia and told her to clear her 9 o'clock. Owen knocked at 9. He was still in his facilities uniform. He came in and looked at the office, the wall of research papers, the patent certificates, the view of the Cambridge courtyard through the window, with the same steady observational interest he had brought to the corridor conversation. She said, sit down. He sat. She said, tell me about myasthenia, what you've seen in the field. He told her.
He was not performing expertise. He was delivering information in the organized, direct sequence of a person whose job had required taking accurate clinical histories under conditions of significant time pressure for 11 years. He described 3 patients he had transported with myasthenic crisis. He described the characteristic presentation. He described what he had looked for. He described the specific detail of the ptosis, the way it differed from stroke-related ptosis, from Horner syndrome, from simple fatigue, the fatigability test, the ice pack test, the specific left-right asymmetry that in combination with the morning severity and the pattern of improvement through the afternoon had been, he said, recognizable. She said, "You should have kept practicing." He said, "I kept practicing. I practice every time I see something worth noticing." He paused. "I just do it in a corridor." She looked at him. She said, "Your son, what school does he go to?" He looked mildly surprised by the direction. He said, "Jefferson Elementary, over in Somerville." She said, "Does he like it?" He said, "He likes his teacher. He's struggling with reading. We're working on it." He said it plainly, without distress, in the way of a person who is handling something and does not need to be handled about it. She said, "Owen, can I ask you to come up to my office when you have a break?" He said, "I have a break at 9. She said, "9 then." She went upstairs, she sat at her desk and she looked at the wall opposite her, and she ran the mechanism in her head, the acetylcholine receptor, the neuromuscular junction, the fatigable ptosis, the asymmetric presentation, the morning severity, and every piece of what she had been experiencing for 4 years was not only consistent with seronegative myasthenia gravis, it was a textbook case of it, presented in a textbook sequence, and that 11 doctors had missed it because they had run the standard panel, seen the negative result, and moved on to the next hypothesis, rather than pursuing the alternative antibody tests that a paramedic with 11 years of field experience had known to ask about in a hallway conversation at 7:20 in the morning. She called her neurologist. She left a message requesting a specific fiber EMG and a full MOSC and LRP4 antibody panel, with a note that said, "Please do not route this to standard autoimmune screening. I need these specific tests." She called the clinical lab she had worked with for 12 years. She called Patricia and told her to clear her 9 o'clock. Owen knocked at 9. He was still in his facilities uniform. He came in and looked at the office, the wall of research papers, the patent certificates, the view of the Cambridge courtyard through the window, with the same steady observational interest he had brought to the corridor conversation. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She said, "Tell me about myasthenia, what you've seen in the field." He told her. He was not performing expertise. He was delivering information in the organized, direct sequence of a person whose job had required taking accurate clinical histories under conditions of significant time pressure for 11 years. He described 3 patients he had transported with myasthenic crisis. He described the characteristic presentation. He described what he had looked for. He described the specific detail of the ptosis, the way it differed from stroke-related ptosis, from Horner syndrome, from simple fatigue, the fatigability test, the ice pack test, the specific left-right asymmetry that in combination with the morning severity and the pattern of improvement through the afternoon had been, he said, recognizable. She said, "You should have kept practicing." He said, "I kept practicing. I practice every time I see something worth noticing." He paused. "I just do it in a corridor." She looked at him. She said, "Your son, what school does he go to?" He looked mildly surprised by the direction. He said, "Jefferson Elementary, over in Somerville." She said, "Does he like it?" He said, "He likes his teacher. He's struggling with reading. We're working on it." He said it plainly, without distress, in the way of a person who is handling something and does not need to be handled about it. She said, "Owen, can I ask you to come up to my office when you have a break?" He said, "I have a break at 9. She said, "9 then." She went upstairs, she sat at her desk and she looked at the wall opposite her, and she ran the mechanism in her head, the acetylcholine receptor, the neuromuscular junction, the fatigable ptosis, the asymmetric presentation, the morning severity, and every piece of what she had been experiencing for 4 years was not only consistent with seronegative myasthenia gravis, it was a textbook case of it, presented in a textbook sequence, and that 11 doctors had missed it because they had run the standard panel, seen the negative result, and moved on to the next hypothesis, rather than pursuing the alternative antibody tests that a paramedic with 11 years of field experience had known to ask about in a hallway conversation at 7:20 in the morning. She called her neurologist. She left a message requesting a specific fiber EMG and a full MuSK and LRP4 antibody panel, with a note that said, "Please do not route this to standard autoimmune screening. I need these specific tests." She called the clinical lab she had worked with for 12 years. She called Patricia and told her to clear her 9 o'clock. Owen knocked at 9. He was still in his facilities uniform. He came in and looked at the office, the wall of research papers, the patent certificates, the view of the Cambridge courtyard through the window, with the same steady observational interest he had brought to the corridor conversation. She said, "Sit down." He sat. She said, "Tell me about myasthenia, what you've seen in the field." He told her. He was not performing expertise. He was delivering information in the organized, direct sequence of a person whose job had required taking accurate clinical histories under conditions of significant time pressure for 11 years. He described 3 patients he had transported with myasthenic crisis. He described the characteristic presentation. He described what he had looked for. He described the specific detail of the ptosis, the way it differed from stroke-related ptosis, from Horner syndrome, from simple fatigue.
Afternoon had been, he said, recognizable. She said, "You should have kept practicing." He said, "I kept practicing. I practice every time I see something worth noticing." He paused. "I just do it in a corridor." She looked at him. She said, "Your son, what school does he go to?" He looked mildly surprised by the direction. He said, "Jefferson Elementary, over in Somerville." She said, "Does he like it?" He said, "He likes his teacher. He's struggling with reading. We're working on it." He said it plainly, without distress, in the way of a person who is handling something and does not need to be handled about it. She said, "Owen, what I'm about to say I want you to hear as directly as I mean it." She looked at him. "In 4 years, and with resources that most medical institutions do not have access to, no one caught what you caught in 3 months from a corridor." He said, "I had an advantage." She said, "What advantage?" He said, "I saw you every day, not for 20 minutes in a clinical setting. Every day, same time, same place, over months." He looked at the window. "Patterns take time to see. Most doctors don't have time." She said, "You made time." He said, "I notice things." He said it the same way he had said it in the corridor, simply as a fact about himself, not a credential. The single fiber EMG was scheduled for the following week. The MuSK and LRP4 panel results came back in 12 days. The LRP4 antibodies were positive, seronegative by the standard panel, positive on the specific test. Myasthenia gravis, LRP4 antibody associated, presenting with ocular and mild generalized features over a 4-year progression. Her neurologist called her on a Thursday afternoon. He said, "I owe you an explanation for how this was missed." She said, "I owe you the explanation. I should have known to ask for these tests myself." He said, "You were the patient, not the clinician." She said, "I am a biochemist who knows this disease exists." She was quiet. That is a different kind of miss. The treatment was established. Pyrostigmine to start, immunosuppression if indicated, monitoring of the progression, not a cure. Myasthenia gravis was a managed condition, not a resolved one, but manageable meant the fog had a name. Manageable meant the morning ptosis had a mechanism she could work with. Manageable meant she could stop spending money on the wrong questions and direct her trust's resources towards something with a foundation. She called her trust administrator and redirected a portion of the research funding toward LRP4 antibody-associated myasthenia gravis, which was one of the least studied antibody subtypes in the myasthenia spectrum, and which had a diagnostic miss rate that her case had just personally confirmed was unacceptably high. She did this on a Monday. On Tuesday, she went to the 3rd floor corridor at 7:20. Owen was there. Same cart, same steady efficiency. He said, "Good morning," without looking up from the baseboard. She said, "Good morning." She paused.
It was LRP4 antibody-positive myasthenia gravis. He stopped. He turned. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. He said, "The specific fiber test?" She said, "Confirmed." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you getting treatment?" She said, "Started last week." She paused. "My neurologist is," there was a diplomatic word for it, recalibrating his approach to the diagnostic sequence for atypical presentations. Owen said, "Good." She said, "I wanted to tell you myself." He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." She said, "I'm the one thanking you." He said, "You asked the question in the hallway. That was the moment." She said, "You made the observation worth asking about." They looked at each other in the third-floor corridor. The Cambridge morning was doing what Cambridge mornings did in early April, trying to be warmer than November and almost succeeding. She said, "Owen, I have a medical research trust." She said it directly, as she said everything that mattered. "We fund diagnostic innovation projects, gap analysis in the clinical pathway, things that fall between the standard protocols and the patient presentation." She paused. "I am one case study. There are thousands." He was listening with the complete attention she had seen him bring to the baseboard, to the corridor, to her eyelid. She said, "I need someone who understands what the field sees that the clinic misses." He said, "That's a real problem." She said, "I know." He said, "A lot of people in EMS see things that never make it into the medical record because there's no pathway for the observation." She said, "I know that too." She paused. "Help me build the pathway." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Can I think about it?" She said, "Until Friday." He said, "Friday." She said, "Good morning, Owen." He said, "Good morning." She went upstairs. She sat at her desk and looked at the Cambridge courtyard and felt the specific quality of a morning that had turned into something she had not anticipated when she had taken the stairs at 7:20. The fog was lighter today. It had been lighter for 2 weeks, since the treatment had been finding its footing in the mechanism it was addressing. The ptosis was still there, but it was less, measurably, verifiably, specifically less, in the way that things improve when you have finally found the right name for what is wrong with them. On Friday morning, she came in at 7:20. She took the elevator because she no longer needed to hide the badge reader and because she had decided that eliminating unnecessary difficulty was not weakness, it was appropriate self-management of a diagnosed condition. She went to her office. At 9:15, she heard a knock. Owen came in. He was not in his facilities uniform. He was in a dark jacket and he was carrying a notebook, and he looked like a person who had made a decision and arrived at it cleanly. He said, "I have a condition." She said, "Name it." He said, "Theo has a school pickup at 3:15, not 3:30, 3:15. She said, "The position ends at 3. He said, "And I need 2 weeks before I start." He said, "I need to give proper notice." He looked at her steadily. "They deserve notice." She said, 2 weeks? He said, "And I want it clear that the research is the job, not the story." He met her eyes. "I don't want to be the janitor who cracked the case. I want to build the framework that means the case doesn't have to be cracked by a janitor in a corridor in the first place." She looked at him. She said, "That is exactly the job." He held out his hand. She shook it. He said, "I'll see you in 2 weeks." She said, "I'll have Patricia set up the onboarding." He nodded. He turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. He looked back at her. He said, "Your left eyelid this morning." She looked at him. He said, "Significantly better." She said, "I know." He said, "Good." He went out and closed the door behind him. She turned to the window. Cambridge was in full April now, the light coming through the courtyard in the specific way of a city that has been winter for a long time and is being convinced, slowly and with evidence, that it is over. She thought about $100 million in 4 years and 47 vials of blood and the specialist in Zurich and the papers her trust had funded and all of the ways she had tried to find the answer from within systems designed to find the answer, and had not. She thought about a man who mopped floors and read eyelids and knew the difference between repetitive nerve stimulation and single-fiber EMG and had a son named Theo who wanted to be an astronaut or a chef and had not decided which. She thought about what it meant that the most important clinical observation of the last 4 years had been made by a person that the medical system had no mechanism to hear from, no pathway for the observation, no record, no protocol. She opened her laptop. She opened the research trust file. She created a new folder. She named it Corridor Observations, Diagnostic Gap Project, and she began typing the first page of a framework that started with a question that had been sitting in plain sight for as long as diagnostic medicine had existed and that no one had built a system to answer. What does the person who sees the patient every day know that the person who sees them for 20 minutes twice a year does not? The answer, she was beginning to understand, is everything. And it took a janitor in a Cambridge corridor on a Tuesday morning in March to make sure she finally asked it out loud. If this story found you today, share it with someone who needed to hear it. Subscribe for a brand new story every single week. We will see you next time.